welcome to today's Ad Week webinar, where we are looking at the evolution of MarTech. And so we're going to have a panel discussion, as we see here again on the title slide, as we're looking at sort of who's winning in this MarTech wars that we are now on. Again, we've got a panel of experts who are going to be sharing all of that, but our webinar today is being sponsored by Similarweb. I'm Stuart File, Vice President of Branded Content at Adweek, and I'm going to be your host for today's webinar. So before we begin, I'm just going to take a few minutes here and make sure that everyone is familiar with the features of our webinar platform and knows what to expect from today's event. Again, we've got a great panel for you. We're very excited to have them all here, and I will introduce them to you in a minute, but their presentation should go somewhere in the 40-minute range. Afterwards, we're going to have plenty of time for audience Q&A. So if at any point during our presentation, if you have a question for our speakers, we're just going to urge you to please use the question tool that you see on the left side of your screen to ask your questions. And in the last 10, 15 minutes of the webinar, we're going to have, again, the ability to raise some of those questions with the panelists. So again, submit your questions as you can and when you have them. It's not too late to invite your colleagues to join us today, and we'd really love it if they would. About 15 minutes ago, we sent everyone a final reminder email for today's webinar. In there, you'll find a link over to the registration page, so grab that link. There's still plenty of time to register for people to register and join us live. But if they can't make it live, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. And we're going to send a link to that on-demand version to everyone about 3:30 Eastern time today. So keep your eyes out for that. We're going to be going through a number of slides as well. We're going to be talking about some of the findings here. Again, this is based on some research from Chief MarTech and also from Similarweb, based on some data from Similarweb. So if you want to download a PDF of the slides, we've made those available as well. You should be able to get them in the Event Resources area tab at the top of your screen. So again, you'll see it attached there to the slide tab that is part of all of this. Feel free to go and download that PDF of the slides whenever you need them. And lastly, I just want to take a moment here and remind everyone to please check out the Adweek webinar calendar, www.adweek.com/webinars. We've got a whole bunch of webinars coming up for this week, one every day. So see what's there, see what we've got coming up, what interests you, sign up for an upcoming webinar. You'll also get full access to our archive of on-demand webinars. Every one we've done in the past year, that's probably right now somewhere around 150 or so of them that you've got access to. So see what's there. Check them all out, adweek.com/webinars. Let me just take a moment here and pardon me if my eyes dart down as I don't have everyone's bio fully memorized here. But again, I'm really happy about the panel we've got. So first off, the panel is going to be managed by Oren Greenberg. Oren is the managing director over at Curve. Curve is a growth marketing consultancy. They're based in London. He, of course, knows everything, working with a large number of international and emerging brands there, helping them navigate growth. And he's going to be driving the conversation with our panelists. Again, we've got Ashley Friedline. Ashley, you may know, he's both the CEO of Guild. He's also was the founder of eConsultancy, which he founded now 21 years ago, 22 years ago, back in 1999. They, of course, are the digital marketing and e-commerce consulting firm running that community, and he'll be speaking, obviously, with all his expertise there. If you cover anything in marketing technology, you know the name Scott Brinker. Scott runs, of course, Chief MarTech and the MarTech Conference. Scott's, of course, known for his now nearly indecipherable landscape of the marketing tech universe, but he's also now VP of Platform Ecosystem over at HubSpot, where, again, he is just a leading voice. We're going to get a lot from him. And from our sponsor today, Similarweb, we've got Thomas Salokis, Thomas there is a strategic consultant where he specializes in agency and management consulting sectors. So again, helping companies with online competitive intelligence, which is, of course, what Similarweb does. So let me bring, as we've done all that, our speakers up on screen here. So bear with me as I make all of this magic happen and I disappear. So let's give this on over to you, Oren, as you are now all up on screen. Welcome, everybody.
Great. Thanks very much. Really appreciate that, Stuart. So let's get stuck in, shall we? So first of all, it's important to understand the context. So we took the entire MarTech landscape, which is quite a lot of websites, and we enriched it with 3 years of traffic. It's actually a little more than 3 years. It's from May 2017 till the end of 2020, till December a few months ago. So here what we can see is that the top 3 websites account for 78% of all of the traffic, and that's Facebook, YouTube, and Google. I think everyone's familiar with Pareto, with the 80-20 rule. I think it's safe to say this blows that out of the water. A pretty crazy monopolization. And let's look at some of the other websites in the MarTech landscape. So the next set of 68 websites account for 20%. And together, that is the top 1% of all of the websites in the entire landscape, so 7,182. And here you can see some examples. So, there's not enough room on the slide to actually show all 71. So I'm just showing the top 25 here. And you can see there's some interesting, examples which are pretty predictable, the Googles and Facebooks and Yahoo and Twitters of the world. But some of them are maybe quirky. You may not be as familiar with them, like Taboola, or perhaps even Stack Overflow, which is a specific community for developers, Criteo and Programmatic. So these aren't necessarily all destination websites. It could also be websites or platforms that have a lot of traffic go through them, like Criteo. So because of that, the Similarweb tool is able to pick up those URLs. And it's still very interesting to think about how these websites and entities are still driving the majority of the traffic to the entire MarTech landscape. So then if we move forward to the remaining amount of websites, they actually account for only 2% of all the traffic. So that 1% of the websites actually accounts for 98% of all the traffic. And the rest of the websites in the MarTech landscape actually only get a very humble 2% of that pie, which is a pretty crazy ratio. It's very interesting now to go to the rest of the panel speakers and see what you guys think about this data in this slide.
Well, as much as I love MarTech companies, and I spend all day visiting MarTech websites, it's my favorite activity, it is understandable, of course, that, most of these top 1%, they're really media companies on the web, and they have a certain amount of offerings in the MarTech space, which is why they're on the landscape. But yeah, I don't have any illusions as to why people are going to YouTube.com. It's probably not to get the latest details on the advertising platform there.
Yeah, I don't have anything much to add on that one, other than it just shows how the massive sort of scale and dominance and sheer traffic numbers of the big players. But of course, it's not just about volume; it's about sort of value and conversion rates and all that kind of stuff. So, so I think yes, we will as we go in delve into some of the details and some of the subcategories in that, which I think are really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really worth noting that a lot of the MarTech landscape, of the 7,000 websites, about 5,000 of them are SaaS. So a lot of this B2B traffic is obviously much lower volume, but higher value, like Ashley is saying. So when you're looking at the data, there is a skew towards B2C, consumer-facing websites. And at this point, you can go, well, why don't you just split it out? And unfortunately, it's not possible because you don't necessarily know if a search event that's happening or someone clicking an ad, if their intent is necessarily consumer or B2B. Also, some websites like Google, they have Google Ads, which is B2B offering, but they also have google.com or .co.uk or .fr, and obviously all of those are consumer facing. So when you're going to Google, you don't know just based on the URL traffic if this is actually going to be a B2B or B2C in terms of the intent. So unfortunately, we can't split that out. So it is interesting to keep that in mind when we're looking at some of the traffic. Okay, so let's continue to the next slide. So really what we're going to look at is the overview of the total traffic to the MarTech landscape. So we can see from 2018 to 2019, there was quite a big jump. It was a 23% growth, which is pretty significant. And that growth can come from other websites outside the MarTech landscape, and it can obviously come from other audiences who haven't been online before who now started using these. There is a percentage of the human population still. This is worldwide traffic that is still going online, and that would explain why some of that traffic increase and where that's coming from. So that accounts for about 358 billion visits. I know that's quite a lot of money, almost as much as Elon Musk just pointed to Bitcoin. And here you can see that 100% of that growth came from just these three websites, from just Google, YouTube, and Facebook. And then at this point, you're probably thinking, but that doesn't really make much sense. How is that possible? 100% of the growth came. Actually isn't. It's actually 101 plus something percent. And you kind of go, wait a second. It's not even 100%. How can it be more than 100%? And the answer is because all the other websites actually shrunk. Some of them obviously went up and some of them went down. But as a whole, the total traffic to everyone else, all the rest of the MarTech landscape actually had a 1.95% drop in growth, which is a pretty staggering and shocking number. It'd be interesting. Any thoughts on this, maybe, Scott?
Yeah, well, I think it's there's so many factors entangled there. I guess one that's interesting to me, and this may come up in some of the other slides too, is how the content strategies of MarTech companies has been evolving. How much of this is about content that's deployed on their existing domains versus increasingly like using other channels like Google, like YouTube, Facebook. Even like I know it's on the top three, but sites like Medium, as a distribution channel for more educational content. I think that is one factor that sort of changes changes where people are getting this content without necessarily implying that, that content from marketing technology companies is no longer relevant.
I think it's very interesting to consider the context as well. The legislation that's happening in Australia with advertising and news agents and really the domination of these three players and how, I think everyone knew they were a monopoly. I think what's really interesting about this data is actually how much of a monopoly they actually are is really quite shocking.
Yeah, I think just to add, I think we're going on to the slide at the moment, but it's interesting for me to see whether that's quite a lot of growth, 23%, but is it slowing over time? So it's suggesting whether is internet reaching a kind of point of saturation. But what this doesn't, I assume, show is traffic within, say, messaging apps, like dark social and stuff. So as well as potentially just the global internet audience maybe starting to plateau, there's also an awful lot of activity and engagement which is going on, in places where you can't see, WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram now or Clubhouse or, So yeah, I assume that that's not captured in here, although those top three, will still own a lot of the media, the properties where a lot of that activity is happening, obviously.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. Thomas, do you have a view on this, on whether or not the dark social traffic would be captured?
No, it wouldn't. Like the only way we can do it was we can actually do a follow-up analysis on using app data as well, which we can do on how many visitors and monthly active users you can. And they actually have over time. So that's something we can investigate deeper in. But yeah, it's definitely not captured here.
Got it. I just need to get a refund on my new baby, and then I can do that as another project on the side and see how I do that much. I don't know how I feel about the refund, but we can give that a whirl. Okay, just in the matter of time, I'm sure the audience is curious. Should we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So, obviously it's very interesting. We saw 2018 to 2019. What happened between 2019 and 2020? And we actually could see that there was growth. It went from 2.06 trillion. These numbers still kind of boggle me, to 2.29 trillion. And that was a 10% growth, obviously not as big a growth as the previous slide. And that came to about 225 billion visits. And here we can see actually the top three were no longer as dominant. They were no longer 101%. They were now 65.6% of the total growth. So where was the rest of that growth from? So the rest of the top 1%, remember this is 68 other websites, drove 34.4%. And if you're really quick on your maths here, you'll probably predict that 99% of the websites, the other 7,111 of the 7,182 websites in the MarTech landscape, only had a 1.02% growth. Now, even though that number probably looks kind of ridiculous in comparison, remember we are talking about billions and trillions. So that 1% increase is still significant. It's obviously just nowhere as significant as this huge volume of traffic that the top 1% of websites are getting. Scott and Ashley, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, if you word it that way, like, hey, MarTech sites, in the long tail got an extra 2 billion visitors in 2020. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty big number. But yeah, I guess when you're comparing it to trillions, not so much.
Yeah, I mean, let's say, as I was saying on the last slide, it's interesting that the percentage growth seems to have dropped, but then of course the absolute numbers are still pretty big. I mean, that's still the population of the United States or something that has grown in 1 year. I guess what I'm kind of curious though, the shift away from the top three, at least there in some of that growth is counted for by other websites, including MarTech. And what I guess is hard to see within that 2020 data though is the effect of the coronavirus pandemic, because I think we know that digital media and digital consumption, e-commerce has obviously boomed. It's progressed 5 years in the space of a year, and media sites on the whole have done, and websites just generally, I think, have done pretty well out of that. So a lot of the publishers have been doing better, particularly the subscription-based publishers have done pretty well over 2020. So I'm wondering whether, as people are particularly looking for news and updates and information and stuff, whether that has accounted for some of that, the rest of the top 1%. I don't know, but that's, just a hypothesis.
Yeah, great point. And we'll get into some of the slides later that touch upon one of those points about how which sites have benefited from this. I'm just going to whiz through to the next one. So here, what was interesting is to get a little bit more specific. And on this graph, what we can see is, the MarTech landscape, the way Scott has designed it, there's 49 different subcategories that different companies fall into. You can see the X is effectively all the categories plotted. On the x-axis, total amount of traffic, and you can see a lot of them are kind of concentrated, and they're getting more than 10 million visits. And then on the y-axis, you can actually see the market share of the largest website in each one of those 49 categories. So just to kind of make that a little bit more tangible, what we're trying interesting is, how much did the top website in the, for instance, agile and lean management, which is a category that had the biggest jump, the biggest website in that category had the most amount of market share increase. So the question is, how much did the market share increase by? And increased by 19%, which is a pretty staggering number. So they suddenly have like almost a fifth more of the entire traffic inside that agile and lean management. I'll show you who they are in a second, which is Atlassian. And here you can see in 2017, they had 44 million visits. And that increased to 96 million, which is a pretty insane point. It'd be very interesting, actually. Ashley, I know, is a big fan of Agile. We tend to talk about this on weekends. Ashley, do you have any thoughts on Agile?
Yes, we're such fun guys, aren't we?
Yes,
I'm sure Scott does too. It's interesting. One of the things we've done, we do quite a lot of research as e-consultancy into digital and marketing skills and capability development. So asking people, what things they're trying to learn about and get better at, as well as what marketing and digital marketing disciplines they're spending money on. But we did some research towards the end of last year. And we were asking also about soft skills. So one of the questions about to what extent do you consider the following soft skills as important for success in a marketing career? And there's a whole bunch of choices, including things like curiosity and emotional intelligence and problem solving. But the two that came out top was the ability to embrace change, and second was collaboration. And so I think partly obviously accentuated again by the pandemic and the need for remote working and digital ways of connecting and collaborating. This has also given a massive boost to agile in the broad sense, as well as the more narrow senses. And so it's not a surprise, I'd say, that we're seeing that coming out in the data in terms of MarTech vendors providing solutions in that space, because marketers are definitely very interested in it.
Yeah, spot on. Yeah, I think that Lean Manifesto, and I'm a big fan of Lean in manufacturing and in software as well. So, which category is dropping the most? So this I thought was interesting because we're very obsessed with winners, and there's a lot more ways to fail than to succeed. But I still think it's very interesting to think about an entire category of MarTech software that's dying off or shrinking. Hopefully, since the people here, there's no one on the call who works for DMP, but effectively, data management platforms as a the top market leader has had a massive drop of 27%, but the whole category is shrinking. We'll look into that in a second. And it kind of feels kind of terrible to actually pinpoint a specific business, but Predictor was one of the ones with the largest drop. And you can see actually very humble traffic to begin with, and actually quite a big drop from 1.1 million to about 20K 2017 to 2020. And I think that's actually more representative of the entire category rather than an individual business. And I think the reason for this is, DMPs are cookie-based, which is problematic in a mobile-first world. And I think a lot of the shift in spend has happened from display, and it's been eaten up by social, and it's been eaten up by search. So that's my thoughts about why DMP is dropping. Scott, do you have any thoughts or insight on this data or this slide?
Yeah, it's a really interesting example of, one of the things that's so fascinating with MarTech in general right now is the speed by which categories rise, but also arguably the speed by which they can fall too. Thinking back to 2017, DMPs were a pretty hot property. But I think, as you mentioned, that basically a few things just shifted in the industry. Certainly as we've gone further down this path of, the death of the third-party cookie. We'll have a moment of silence for that. But then also, just the structure of the advertising, digital advertising industry, really becoming such a, powerful duopoly between Google and Facebook sort of changed the dynamics of really what are the tools people are primarily using, to manage that advertising. And I think you might even have this in an upcoming slide, but, the category of customer data platforms in many ways took some of the DNA of DMPs and sort of took it to a broader context. And so to some degree, I look at the slide down of the DMP and the rise of the CDP as actually being, related, not just correlated.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point and very, very relevant. So actually, let's start getting into a bit more of the detail. So here you can see these are all the categories, and they've been plotted. And the x-axis is, it's a little small for me. Let's just see that a little bigger. Yeah, so the x-axis is the total amount of traffic for 2017, and 2020 is the y-axis is 2020 traffic. But effectively, you can see we plotted all of the different categories to understand where the growth came from. So one of the more interesting ones that had ridiculous growth, it's 232% in terms of total traffic, was account-based marketing. And I think that's really speaking to sales and marketing and the integration between them. And I think there's ROI. I think companies are driving good returns from the investment in ABM, and that's why the category is growing. It's still very niche. There's only a handful of key players in that, like Demand Base and obviously HubSpot, which I'm sure you can ask Scott about ABM later. And then the next, right, so there's actually, there's only 30 players in that ABM category. So it's still very nascent. CRM in comparison is about 251 players. So, ABM is still very much in its infancy. And the next one, which had like insane growth, you can see governance, compliance, and privacy. Unsurprisingly, 569% growth. And that is obviously COPA, GDPR. I think Cambridge Analytica didn't really help. So quite a bit of growth in that category. And you can actually see on the right hand, the little orange blobs are representing where these three categories actually are. So there's 54 players in the governance, compliance, and privacy space. And then CDP, as Scott predicted, and I know he's been following this, and he did a webinar the other day on the state of CDPs. And you can see the three categories here actually on the right, they're actually on the far left. And this is because they're very small and very new. So it's not surprising that the categories that are growing the most are the categories that are also the smallest in terms of total traffic volume. You can see CDP is about 54 players in that category, very similar to the governance, compliance, and privacy. The problem is obviously every year, different businesses have lots of different services and they shift from category to category. So it's very hard to actually nail down a concrete number in the category. Scott, do you have any thoughts on this slide? On the you mentioned CDPs. Any thoughts on the other two, perhaps?
Yeah, this was one of the more fascinating findings from your research here that, I think is really telling, because it does start to show you the patterns of what's emerging. I think the one thing that's a little bit tricky about this is we see this pattern now where an independent group of MarTech startups will pioneer some sort of technology or some sort of tactics, but then as those things start to gain momentum, very often then the larger, marketing clouds and, MarTech platforms out there will start to embrace and absorb some of that capability themselves. And so it's interesting, if we just pick CDPs, it's not at all surprising to me that, there's been 163% growth in traffic to the websites of, pure play CDP companies. But I bet you've seen probably at least, that same amount of traffic now starting to go to some of the larger, clouds and platforms in the industry, who are now also telling a CDP story, so that when you type CDP for marketing into Google, where are you being sent?
Yeah, great point. So just obviously on the CDP, I thought it was very interesting to show a tangible example of one of the fastest growing segment, which just got bought out by Twilio for $3.2 billion a few months ago. And you can actually see the numbers that aren't so critical. What's more important to see is the curve direction. And you can see Segment is growing rapidly, and you can see the whole CDP category is following with a very similar trend and very similar growth rate. So I think it's very, I think it's this instance where, rising waters and all the boats rise as well. I think it's kind of interesting to think about the top player and how they're affected in each one of these categories. And just aware of time, I'm going to kind of skip through some of the more interesting slides ahead of us. So what we were also curious about is, which ones dropped? We're talking about the three that grew the most. We're also interested in the ones that shrunk the most. And personally, I was quite surprised to see marketing analytics, performance, and attribution drop. And I was quite surprised to see social media marketing and monitoring dropping. But DMPs, because of the rise of CDPs and everything we talked about, wasn't too surprising. And then let's just look at a tangible example, which is Ask.fm. And you can see they actually had a massive drop, hundreds of millions of traffic, monthly, and over, 3 years or so, they've really dropped catastrophically. I've never even heard of Ask.fm until I saw this data, and I was like, who are these guys and how can I get so much traffic? And I've never heard of them. And then you can see the whole category as a whole is dropping, and Ask.fm, very similar to Segment on the rise, is dropping as a whole. And it'd be interesting to get Ashley's thoughts on this slide. I know he has a passion for dropping graphs.
Yeah, well, I'm just maybe if you go back to the slide 8, which has just got those categories, which are the ones which have shrunk the most, because I found this pretty surprising, to be honest. Whereas, you know, the ones that had grown, I think we can all agree with. Some data from some research we've done at eConsultancy, where we asked people about a question: if you could stake your career on learning one skill, what would it be? And the one that came out top was data analysis and measurement. And yet it suggests here that sort of marketing performance, data analytics maybe is not, it doesn't have, the interest is dropping. Data management platforms we've already talked about. And so I find that a little bit surprising. I can only say that, or my sort of hypothesis might be that, for example, some of the areas where we see a lot of interest in terms of sort of marketers wanting to learn, look for solutions and things around content marketing. So content marketing doesn't specifically, I think, show here in the analysis of a category, nor does SEO, for example. But content marketing and SEO typically come out, very strongly in, a lot of the research we've done in terms of things that are growing in importance. So it might be that these are just showing a drop just because there are other categories like content marketing which are, showing an increase, or it might be that people, think they they understand these things and that they don't need, they've already made a decision on a technology vendor maybe, and therefore what your data is showing is that the hot new things, or these are sort of more established, more mature categories. And so it's a bit like whenever you talk about email, for example, no one's interested in email, they claim, and yet it's still easily one of the biggest and still most valuable and important channels. They never show in any trends or charts. I'm wondering if that's sort of effect as well, that these are almost so mature now that they're not so exciting and sexy and don't get the traffic, but they're still very big and important. That's my guess.
Scott, do you have any insight or any feedback on what Ashley was saying?
Yeah, well, a little bit to build on what Ashley was saying. I think we can go back to the comment earlier that in some of these cases, it's not that the category is no longer relevant. It's really just, where are people getting the most information about what they do next? At this point in time, are people in social media marketing getting most of their information and visiting most of the time the vendors of these technologies? Or has there just become such an incredible community of social media marketing experts out there that, frankly, they get a lot of the traffic for people want to understand this more and better? The only other thing I just sort of maybe flag as a category question here is, because I agree, the marketing analytics going down by 56% does seem counterintuitive. I think one thing to consider here is the marketing analytics performance and attribution category on my landscape was a pretty narrow category. And I suspect if we look at the growth of analytics adoption inside marketing departments, while some of it is coming from these specialist vendors, I suspect a whole bunch of it is coming from simply a broader embrace of business intelligence tools inside the marketing department. So the rise of, Looker and Tableau and, things like that. And so that just might be one of the factors balancing that out.
Very interesting point. All right, let's. We've got slides to get through and limited time, so sorry for. I'm sure we can talk about this till we're blue in the face. Right. So here we're looking at the traffic growth distribution between small, medium, and big websites. So small had 150,000 visits, medium up to 150K, and then 150K to 1.5 mil, medium, and then big is 1.5 mil plus. So what we're interested in is, are they growing in different percentages? What's the relationship between them? So here we can see the small, they obviously declined 16%, a relatively small decline. medium declined 53%, and big declined by 45%. So obviously a 16% decline when you're small and you don't have much traffic isn't so significant. I was pretty surprised to see that medium have more of a loss than big, than websites that have a lot of traffic. And then very interesting to think about the stagnant websites. And I was really surprised to see that small category has so much stagnant traffic compared to the medium and big. And then when we're looking at the growth, so small had nice growth, 20%, but medium had much better growth at 28%, and then big had a lot of growth at 35%. And I think it's very clear that when you're big, it's easier to get more traffic. I guess you're more established brand, better budgets. Now, what was very unsurprising is that small had much greater rapid growth than any of, bit of a funny loop going on there, apologies. But effectively, you can see that the rapid, big website was much smaller than the medium and small. So it's not surprising, there we go, that when you're small, you have rapid growth. When you're medium, you have somewhat rapid growth. And when you're big, you have very little rapid growth. That's not very surprising. Just going to skip to the next slide, even though this is a very interesting slide and I'm sure worth discussing, just given that we've only got a few minutes left. This was a very interesting slide which showed the distribution of traffic to websites. And you can actually see the majority of traffic as a source. And this is, I think, probably one of the most interesting features of Similarweb is that it can show you the actual traffic sources and where traffic is coming from. And you can see direct was 58% and organic search was a staggering 37%, where paid ads and display social referrals are really negligible. But what was a specific tangible approach I think was really fascinating from this was that hyper-growth websites had referral traffic of 11% on average, which compared to the benchmark of 3% is considerably higher. And I think if you're either investing and think about M&A for a website, or you're working for a company like this, or you're thinking about moving to a company like this and changing jobs, if their referral traffic is so high, I think it's a really interesting indicator, a predictive indicator that's very powerful and very unique to this piece of research, in my opinion. Probably the most tangible of the insight in this deck, personally. It'd be interesting to hear from Ashley and Scott. What do you guys think about this traffic mix?
Yeah, I found this really interesting. I mean, partly just that the paid search and things were so small and social. What it made me wonder, and it relates to the previous slide, is to what degree these results are a reflection of search rankings, essentially. So that because so much is coming from organic search, and that I think what you might expect is the big company on the big terms can get bigger quicker. The smaller companies can rank maybe and compete on niche terms or phrases and still kind of grow okay, but maybe it hollows out the middle a bit. And that's the previous slide where you had actually the ones losing the most were the mid-sized companies. I wonder if that is a reflection of the way that search rankings and key phrases and those battles play out. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, I think it's, my takeaway from this was, just as you had said earlier, email, despite not being the sexy headline, is where a lot of the real work gets done. I think, this data is just a really clear reminder. I mean, search engine optimization is a huge part of this. I mean, MarTech is just so new. It's changing so much. I love that thing you said from your study that, just being able to adapt to change is like the most valuable skill in marketing. And so what you imagine here is an entire industry that is continually trying to answer new questions. And if you can be, as a MarTech vendor, if you can find a way through an SEO strategy to be able to provide those answers and be ranking in organic search, that just feels like a #1 growth strategy to lean into.
Yeah, very interesting. When I first saw this slide, I didn't believe it. I had to actually go to Thomas and verify that this was accurate. And then I showed it to Rand Fishkin, and he said there was a company called Jump who don't operate anymore. And he said they have a like for like, and they have a traffic analysis tool. And then I was actually validated that I believe this actually is true, that organic search is key, word of mouth is key. But I think, this email specifically wouldn't be captured in here, because when people are clicking it, unless it specifically goes to a website, you're not necessarily going to go to the source, to the URL of that website. It could be engaging or interacting with a different way. So Tor wouldn't necessarily pick that up as a specific channel. I just want to check on time quickly and see if we can. Do we have time for one more slide? Okay, we have one more slide, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So let's just go to one more. So, I mean, really, this was the reason I wanted to end on this, because I thought it was the most, I guess, the summary slide for the deck, which was that really, when you think about all the other websites, the 7,111, because, the giants, the monopolies, they're not really so interesting to talk about because everyone knows them. I'm really interested in the long tail and the businesses that I engage with, even though I have a few clients in that top 1%. But when I think about the rest of the websites who are really, trying to grow as a business, you look at the traffic pattern, it's interesting to see that it is very variable. But as a whole, we can say that 63% of them are stagnant or in decline, and they're not doing very well. And 37% actually managing to grow, which is just a little over a third. And if you think about the traffic distribution and you think about the fragmentation, all this means that it's getting more competitive. So really, you just need to double down as a business on your USP and the value that you add. You need to carve out your niche in order to compete in what is a jungle, where it is very difficult out there in terms of, it's not so easy. You just set up a MarTech website, you hope to be part of the landscape, and then you're going to skyrocket. Is really difficult. And I think this slide represents, I guess, quantifies how difficult it is. I think it's like, how hard is it? It's like 2/3 hard. I'm not really sure if that's the most sensical way to present it. That's how I interpreted the slide. So, I mean, just on this final slide, Scott, Ashley, or Thomas, do you guys have any thoughts?
It's funny, Oren. One of the things I've been explaining for years as to why the MarTech landscape keeps growing is because barriers to entry for creating software have just plummeted. I mean, really, at this point in time, anyone can create a software product and get it out into the world. Where the battle is, it's entirely in getting attention. And I think, your research that you did here with Similarweb, really, puts the spotlight on, okay, listen, you can have a fantastic product idea, you can build it, you can get it to market, but what your go-to-market strategy is to deal with the reality of this noise, that's where the battle is won or lost.
Yeah, I think, 2 points that came out for me. One was importance of understanding the language and terminology that's going on in the market in order that you can kind of capture that interest. So, moving with the times, as it were. But also, and I think HubSpot are a fantastic example of this. If you're really brave, you maybe, in order to compete in this jungle, is you invent your own terminology. So like HubSpot with their inbound marketing, I think kind of coined that term really, and created a category really, and created a search phrase, and created a czar, which is a bold but ingenious thing to do if you can pull it off. And the other point is that given it is so hard to get any attention, I think we often, I say we, MarTech vendors in this sense, but website owners generally, perhaps still don't focus enough on conversion rate optimization, customer experience, and loyalty and things. So the kind of middle and the bits and the bottom parts of the funnel and are post sale and service. So a lot of what we're talking about here is getting traffic. Well, that's fine, but obviously that's inherently there's no value in that necessarily unless you're selling ads. In fact, there's a cost to it. So I think this just all reminds me, God, if you can get those people to your site, you've got to be damn sure you make the most of engaging them and keeping them and all that.
Absolutely. It's all about conversion rate optimization nowadays. That's it. I believe we've run out of time. I know we have lots of questions. So I'm going to pass it to the esteemed Stefan to pass on the Q&A mode. So, obviously the end of part one.
Great. Well, thank you, Oren. And again, for our panel, Ashley, Scott, and Thomas, again, for great insights. I think as we look at this, right, it's always interesting. We know that this MarTech landscape is out there. We know a large part of our audience are MarTech vendors. It's always interesting to see, how do you get attention? Are you getting the right kind of attention? What does all of this ultimately mean? We're going to get some audience questions in just a second. I just want to, again, couple quick reminders here to our audience. A lot of detail in those slides that Oren was sharing. If you want to get a copy of the slides, and I'm sure you do, you can find them right now, Event Resources. You will see that tab up at the top of the slides window on your screen. So go on in there. You can download a PDF of the slides at any point. Share those with your colleagues, or certainly use them as a way to sort of start your next discussion. Also, today's webinar has been recorded and will be available on demand. We're going to send you a link to that on-demand recording about 3:30 today. Share that with your colleagues. Or if you want to go back and listen to this again, you're always welcome to check out the recording and do all that. Let's get into some of these questions. And so maybe we turn this into a lightning round, as we've got about 10 minutes or so here, gentlemen. So let's talk a little bit about, one of the things here. We talk about the big companies. We know who's out there in all of this. We know who's got a lot of the share. We've got that 99%. What can you do to sort of build your traffic, right? Get people to sort of understand your point of view on there. So on a more practical level, right? Is it because you're just focused on your products? Do you need to add thought leadership? Do you need to do an SEO strategy? What do you need to do to sort of get yourself heard when you're a smaller vendor in this MarTech landscape? So Scott, you're the owner of the MarTech landscape. You watch the tiny companies come through. What do you see in some of this?
Yeah, well, the way that landscape comes together every year is we actually visit every single one of those websites. And I, just to be completely candid, a large percentage of those websites are terrible. They suck. It's like really hard to understand what the company does, what their value proposition is. And I actually think this is good news for those who really want to do this right, because as we were talking earlier, I mean, this is such a new landscape. Marketers have so many questions. They're trying to understand how to implement these capabilities in their companies. And there aren't a lot of vendors out there who are doing a really good job answering those questions, and I suspect the correlation between those who are and their impact on traffic here is incredibly high.
Right. So it's not the technology that is sometimes the differentiator. It's the marketing for the MarTech companies. Again, Ashley, as a consultant and someone who has sort of done there, you build these communities as you do all this and following this area. What do you see among them as sort of how they stand out, and what you see is ultimately effective to get your voice heard?
I think obviously it depends what scale of company you are. If you're, a newish startup or mid-size, it's going to be different to if you're Salesforce or something. And I think the kind of, the usual playbook of content / thought leadership in its various forms, email, as we mentioned, still, social still, SEO and PPC still, they need to be part of the mix. But you still need a good, clear proposition, the customer experience, conversion rate optimization we've talked about, and also I think now really the customer sort of service and support element. I think that kind of idea of like almost ratings and reviews. I know it's sort of talking B2B, but people talk. They you don't necessarily always see it. I do think that has become more important overall. That good marketing is super important, but it can't mask a bad product or a service, so you have to sort of fix that piece. I suppose the other thing I'd say, an area I'm particularly passionate about, and I've even I'm trying to popularize a new term, a new acronym, which is CBM. It's you've got ABM, but I've gone two better with CBM, which is for community-based marketing. And Stuart, you mentioned communities there. And I do feel there's an opportunity, for tech vendors, but all sorts of businesses, particularly at the moment, of course, because we're also distanced and alienated, and still the future of work is going to be more remote. We're going to have to connect more digitally. I just feel there's an opportunity there to create communities, which are likely going to be smaller, higher value of prospects or customer communities, and which is what Guild does. But so I feel there's a real opportunity there to stand out by thought, leadership and ownership, but not just content, but adding the people into that mix and having a sort of tight-knit community. That's how the internet kind of started after its defense incarnation. And I think we are seeing a little bit of a return to community, which is not on the big social media platforms, slightly more owned media or owned communities.
I was going to say, where do those communities come from? I mean, look, Adweek, we're technically a community, right? We're a business publisher. eConsultancy, technically a community. HubSpot, look, I mean, you guys just made a huge acquisition that's a little bit, it was a bit of a surprise for some people, right? And in the areas where you go, again, the idea that of a community, right? HubSpot also always known for sort of, as much of a publisher out there, right? You go on and you Google writing a headline, you're going to show up there. Is that what brands need to start to do? Do brands become publishers? Do brands go out there? Ashley, what is your, how are you defining that community that way?
Oh, I've somewhere or other, I've got a definition for community, or specifically for B2B communities, which I should know off the top of my head, but I don't. But anyway, sort of broadly about having coming together around a shared interest, for sort of mutual support over time, critically. Maybe a bit controversially, most publishers, in my experience, and a lot of media owners, don't have community. They have readers, maybe. They might even have subscribers. They might even have members, but they don't really have community. It's a pretty broadcast experience. Whereas I think, community has to be something which, everybody can be part of. It's sort of a two-way, participatory kind of experience. But anyone can have that community. And I think, so a lot of tech vendors, MarTech vendors do that. I mean, Salesforce does it with Trailblazers, Adobe owns CMO.com. I'm trying to think recently Salesforce bought someone else, didn't they? But so, yes, I think it's been a long time. Yes. No, someone else I think they bought, like a group of senior marketers, C-suite marketers. So I think it's long been the case that big tech vendors, have bigger audiences in terms of reach, bigger events. Think of Salesforce and Dreamforce and Adobe, and they're much bigger than the media owners like us. That's been true for a long time. So there's no reason, when they're doing community, their challenge is that they're not perceived to be independent, of course, that they've got something to sell. Whereas as a media owner, in theory, you can provide that kind of middle thing. So I don't think, and no one has a right to community, but equally that means anyone equally can do it. And I think, HubSpot do that well. I've seen all the other ones, Drift was on kind of recently, but so a lot of the tech vendors are doing community stuff quite well. Some of the MarTech vendors, but I think there's an opportunity to do more, and not just do more webinars and white papers and virtual events. That starts to feel a little bit saturated. So what's your new playbook? What do you do next? And I think if you can create that emotional connection, that's very powerful.
Oren, as a person in growth, and you specialize as you're working with some of these, again, talking a little bit about the small, but by small I really mean the small and mid-size in this community. Where are they going both for the growth? Look, a lot of their growth is based on lead gen. They need to sort of get people to their sites because they need them to download things. They need to understand who's qualified as they come through. If they're not getting the traffic, if they're in an area like that, where are they going for leads?
Yeah, I think there's, I think I can think of the top of my head, like 23 different reasons for where they go wrong. But I'd say the most common ones, like the technology implementation is poor. The systems aren't well integrated. I think they're targeting the wrong audience and they're not sure. And I think to answer the specific question of where they're going for leads, what I notice is there's a big disconnect between sales and marketing, where marketing are generating leads and talking about leads and marketing qualified leads, and sales are interested in sales qualified leads, and marketing are celebrating when they're achieving leads and marketing qualified leads, and sales are way behind their targets because they haven't received sales qualified leads, because there's a quality definition, which is where the two different departments, and I think that's where the rise of the chief revenue officer has come about as an attempt to kind of reconcile this gap. Yeah, I think the businesses like measurability, so they're going for predictable channels, which are actually very expensive. The LinkedIn, the Google ads, the Facebook ads, but that's where the volume is. That's where a lot of the visits are, and that's where a lot of the people are, and that's why they're spending the money there. And I think the businesses who are producing exceptional quality content that is very pertinent for their audiences are seeing greater success, but also ones who are more human. Like if you look at what Gong are doing a really fantastic job with their content marketing, B2B SaaS enterprise. Intercom are doing fantastic work with their content marketing. They had a big team. There's a lot of companies that, they're, even HubSpot as well, they're producing exceptional content. And I think that is valuable, but I do think that is becoming more saturated, and community and some of the foundations will get them to the growth that they need.
Yeah, and Thomas, one question just to toss your way here. Again, this idea of using sort of traffic growth and trends in traffic growth for businesses is sort of a meaningful metric. Can you talk a little bit about why it's a meaningful metric, and really what do people want to be doing to sort of understand some of the relevancy of traffic growth? I think you might be muted, by the way.
Sorry. So the traffic growth in general is very good understanding of demand. So what we've been doing a lot, you can do it with keyword search volume or something else. But now, because you can actually look at traffic volume and traffic growth over time, it's probably one of the best proxies for growth in demand and actually that interest in there. Mm-hmm. Like there are a lot of metrics that you can use, and we have additional metrics that you can look at. Is everything from conversion and engagement as well. So like as Oren said, and you were talking about growth and particular channels that actually are there for growth. As Oren said, referrals is becoming a big part of it, and affiliate networks and affiliate traffic is actually becoming so huge in many industries because of bringing not just traffic, but highly engaged traffic. And as HubSpot was preaching for years now, is when someone else talking about you, that's the kind of mentions you want to get. It's not when you talking on yourself or your content or you trying to promote something. It's when someone else talking about you and bringing you stuff like actual consumers to your site. That's the kind of traffic you want to get. And like it's a combination of demand and the quality of that demand. That's what you want to be measuring.
Got it. Gentlemen, we are at the end of our time. We are fast approaching the top of the hour here. So I really appreciate your time. Again, all four of you. Oren as our host from Curve, Ashley certainly at eConsultancy, Scott Brinker. Everyone probably knows your name, and obviously we all know you're from HubSpot right now because you've got that big HubSpot sign behind you. And again, Thomas from Similarweb. Again, thanks. Thank you for doing all of that stuff. Just final reminders to our audience. Again, slides, you'll find them, Event Resources tab. Check that stuff out. 3:30 today, we're going to send you that link to the on-demand version. Lastly, adweek.com/webinars, our webinar calendar. See what's there. Sign up for an upcoming webinar. Check out our archive as well. So again, thanks to our speakers. Thanks to our audience for taking time out of your busy day. And we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming Adweek webinar. Thank you, everybody.